Welcome again, everyone. My name is Stu McKenzie. I'm the Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, hosted here at George Mason University. Thanks for joining us online today for this presentation in our full series of insights into transnational organized crime. As we're exclusively online today, please do mute your microphones if you haven't already done so. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. That'll be moderated by CINA's director, Dr. Jim Jones. And so if you have a question, you can type it into the chat box, which you should find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This fall, by the way, we're proudly hosting a series of talks on topics like money laundering and cybercrime, network data and gangs, and on digital forensics. So if these sound interesting and relevant to you, please sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it. You can find additional detail on these events and much more on our website. Our distinguished speaker this afternoon is Ms. Crysta Price. Crysta holds a master's degree in data science, and she's director of the Human Trafficking Initiative at Creighton University. She's also CEO of HTI Labs, which uses data-driven research and technology to combat human trafficking and to support survivors. In 2017, Crysta drafted a pivotal Nebraska law that clears victims' criminal records of crimes that they were forced to commit. And in 2019, HTI Labs' work brought down the largest of the international sex trafficking rings. Crysta has very kindly accepted our invitation to talk today about some of HTI Labs' work in this area. And the title of her presentation is Finding Trafficking Networks in Online Commercial Sex Ads. Crysta, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And if you're ready, I will hand off to you for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm excited to talk through what it is that we have been working on for the past five years or so. So I've been studying the issue of human trafficking for about 7 years, as mentioned, coming from the fields of data science and international relations. Also the founder and CEO of HTI Labs, which can be traced really all the way back to my undergraduate research. Today, we are a team of 10 whose mission is to fight sex trafficking, domestic violence, assault, and stalking by creating sustainable data-driven research and technology, really in collaboration with our community partners. And to identify and evaluate holistic strategies to counter these problems, where at the heart of everything that we do is research. We really believe that effective research and technology needs to be embedded in community efforts and grounded in a deep understanding of the substantive issues and relevant contexts. So we'll seek to understand, how do these problems work? What are the gaps and challenges that frontline entities face, and what do they need? As data scientists and engineers, we leverage technology to take it much further. So we will generate data that does not yet exist and integrate information that the community already has in order to connect the dots. And we also work with partners on the front lines to solve problems by developing policy or building tools and software for better identification, response, investigation, and also provision of services. Our roots trace back to my joining an experimental research lab at Creighton University in 2012 that brought together math, computer science, and international political theory. And we were very methods focused, specifically studying network analysis and graph theory and applying it to international issues. Since it was funded by an intelligence community grant, often those international issues would be one that were kind of relevant to national security. And so I led a team that created a theoretical model of international trafficking flows. And that identified sort of key parts of the network that, when targeted, would do the most damage to global trafficking in the long run. To make this more actionable, I wanted to do a similar concept, but looking at trafficking across the United States. And so over time, this project necessarily evolved to deal with the near complete lack of data on trafficking. And we ultimately arrived at a novel approach using online ads, data science, and network analysis to identify potential trafficking networks within the commercial sex industry. Thanks to a private research grant in 2015, I was able to pursue the idea, and the Human Trafficking Initiative, or HTI, was born. If our algorithms were going to be useful in solving real problems, then they needed to reflect the real world. And so in addition to studying the problem, we really have worked hand in hand with people on the ground. As we became increasingly integrated with the anti-trafficking community, we realized that we could better meet our partners' needs by becoming a social enterprise. And so about 2 years ago, HTI Labs was born. While our work has been incubated locally, as I go through it, really locally kind of with our partners, we're now at the point of implementing nationally. So the idea of HTI Labs and everything that we do here stems from my frustration at the complete lack of data to work with as a grad student. And not only do we build research and technology in support of anti-trafficking, but we really do so in a way that will create ongoing data, allowing for ongoing research into how best to tackle these issues. While that effort encompasses a number of issues related to sexual violence, I will be focusing most of today's comments on sex trafficking and our efforts to help law enforcement identify, investigate, and successfully prosecute traffickers. And it is important to note that we are also heavily involved in helping victims escape and rebuild their lives through our policy work and our work with victim service providers. Since this project is now largely in the hands of our head of research and data science, Katie Patino, I will have her join me for the Q&A portion of this. Katie started with the company about 2 years ago and comes from a biomedical research background, and she's been leading a lot of the work that I'll go through today. So sex trafficking is the element of the larger commercial sex industry that involves a lack of consent. And this means that it is very difficult to identify. Essentially, human trafficking is when someone is facilitating your exploitation without your consent. And that exploitation can be commercial sexual exploitation, forced labor, or organ removal. The definition of trafficking really requires an act, a means, and a purpose. And in the case of minors, merely the fact that they're being sold for sex legally means that they are being trafficked. For adults, sex trafficking is considerably more difficult to identify because of the nuance involved in the means, just force, fraud, and coercion. Victims are rarely kidnapped or chained up in a basement, that kind of concept that we often think about when we think of trafficking. And so the real question to ask is, how exactly is it that an adult was successfully exploited without their consent? Was it through force? Was it through fraud? Was it through coercion? At the heart of all of it is really manipulation and control. Traffickers intricately sort of weave a web of manipulation and control around their victims to make it difficult to leave. And as a result, many victims have difficulty coming forward. It'll be, because they fear prosecution for prostitution or deportation, a fear that traffickers actually encourage. They may have difficulty coming forward because their traffickers are often intimate partners, leading to very complex victim-offender relationships, similar to domestic violence. Or they may have difficulty coming forward because of the trauma that they've experienced. And if traffickers are successful, then their victims often do not register the experience as trafficking, but rather view themselves as culpable to crimes that they've committed with their trafficker. Even if survivors are able to leave, it can often take years of mental health work to recognize the situation as trafficking. And we can't really forget the difficulty that our criminal justice system has in dealing with crimes related to sexual violence. It's worth underscoring that the lack of confidentiality, fears of repercussion, and the community connections often enjoyed by perpetrators make justice seeking even more difficult for survivors. And so as a consequence, identification of sex trafficking cases often rests on the ability to discern this evidence of a web of manipulation and control. The identification challenge is made even more difficult by the fact that sex trafficking is a hidden population that coexists within the larger commercial sex industry, which is also, to a lesser extent, a hidden population with zero good data. And even if you had good data temporarily, the industry is constantly evolving. Moreover, it's really like drugs in that it is a market. You have traffickers supplying something to buyers. But instead of heroin or cocaine, that something is a sex act with a human being. And sex acts are a sort of normal legal thing in society. This means that effective networks blend in completely with their surroundings. So like terrorism, it's nearly impossible to identify without technology and information on the ground. But unlike terrorism, there are not multiple government agencies dedicated solely to identifying and dismantling trafficking networks. And so it really is kind of left up to a decentralized group of entities mandated to do something about it. And these different entities might notice one or two small red flags that alone wouldn't really signal trafficking. It's only once it's taken all together that you can see it as this potential trafficking situation. The problem is that these information silos are pretty long-standing. The system really was not built for data sharing. And so we work to overcome those problems. Our approach is to work top-down to identify as much as possible of that larger commercial sex industry, and then working bottom-up with law enforcement and service providers to identify specific instances of trafficking within that industry. This really allows us to estimate the portion of the commercial sex market that is trafficking, and the more feedback that we get from our community partners, the better those estimates become. We identify traffickers by first identifying the sex providers who might be trafficked, and then investigating their potential traffickers. And we do it this way because traffickers are far less visible than sex providers. Sex providers need to advertise or communicate with buyers in some way, and so they can't be completely underground. And we begin by capturing data across all segments of the commercial sex industry, after which we sort of make connections across the data using algorithms, helping us to understand the network structure and individual sex provider vulnerabilities. Based on these factors, we predict trafficking risk, and we push the high-risk leads to our law enforcement partners via this online leads platform that we have developed. And then we actively sort of assist in the ensuing investigations off those leads. What we learn also helps to power another platform that we've built, which is called PAVE. And PAVE facilitates a single sort of community-wide screening, assessment, and referral process, where all roads are leading to the potential victim being identified in the long run and connected to services in the short run. Together, LEADS and PAVE constitute an ecosystem that helps communities identify and respond to situations of potential trafficking in a way that allows everyone to kind of learn from each other. Our strategy is informed by the fact that trafficking looks different in each segment of the commercial sex market. We've defined these segments based on the perspective of the sex buyer and how sexual services are packaged and delivered for them. As I go through this, I'm going to use terminology like sex provider or pimp or manager rather than trafficking victim or trafficker. And this is not intended to imply agency, nor does it exclude coercive or exploitative conditions. Rather, it's really intended to encompass the full continuum of conditions that can be found in the sex trade. And the use of these terms, not trying to seek to discount that pimps and traffickers often exercise significant control over the lives of sex providers, including posting their ads and transporting them. Outdoor solicitation is often associated with a higher risk of experiencing violence and exploitation. It's often associated with, violence, drugs, and survival sex. Due to the dangers involved, there's a high level of pimping in this segment as a means of sort of protection. Think of a provider not wanting to stand on the street corner alone, right? And there have always been these sort of notorious locations in cities and in neighborhoods where this is happening. Historically, though, government policy is focused on rooting out this segment, or at least removing it from public view. And this has pushed much of it really into these indoor spaces like brothels, which means that there are a lot of vulnerable people who have transitioned indoors, where it's a bit more hidden. Today's commercial sex industry is a combination of this phenomenon together with the rise of online ads, both of which really make trafficking less visible. I should note, though, that there are some reports, including a recent study, that shows that outdoor solicitation may actually be increasing with the more recent government policy efforts focused on eradicating online sex activity. Much of the commercial sex activity that takes place today in the United States is in this call girl escort services segment. And this segment can range from an independent sex provider to an agency that has call centers to coordinate the transaction. Providers in this segment can also be represented by a pimp, where this relationship can range from strictly a business relationship to an intimate partner relationship. What really ties this segment together is the fact that sex buyers often solicit specific escorts that are usually advertised online, and then they arrange to meet them at a hotel or private residence of either the providers or the agency's choosing, or the buyer's choosing. In this next segment, both solicitation and delivery of services are purely online or remote. There's no in-person interaction between the sex buyer and sex provider. The venue can really be anywhere, although it's usually out of a person's home. In some cases, an agency of what's referred to as like cam girls will all work out of the same location. And this segment may often be a service in addition to escorting. And given that this segment serves as a somewhat easy way to enter the industry, particularly in times of financial stress, the segment is especially relevant in today's commercial sex market due to the effects of COVID. The last three segments that I'll go through here all have brick and mortar locations. Illicit massage parlors often operate under the facade of a legal business, where sex buyers can walk in or call in advance to set up an appointment. Similar to in-call escort agencies, women are moved from one massage parlor to another to keep things fresh. However, unlike with in-call agencies, buyers really know that they're negotiating with the business, and online ads are more generally advertising the spa or the massage parlor as opposed to one sort of individual person that's at the massage parlor. Although they appear to be single storefronts, the majority of the businesses in this segment are part of a larger network, with 1 to 3 people usually owning several businesses. Then you have known brothels or residences where sex buyers will go to solicit sex. Unless it is a legalized brothel, like in some counties in Nevada, it often operates through word of mouth advertising, which makes it exceptionally difficult to detect. And this is a major problem because residential neighborhood brothels tend to involve interfamilial or intimate partner trafficking, which has the highest percentage of minor victims, often children. This final segment consists of known legal businesses where buyers can go to meet sex providers. These include strip clubs, cantina bars, and casinos. And the sex acts happen either behind the scenes at this legal location or elsewhere after contact is made at the location. These enterprises may be run entirely by an organized criminal network, or they can be a standalone business. Pimps may also traffic their victims out of this location. For example, a trafficker can have one of his girls work at a strip club to meet clients and sell sex as private dances in the back room. And the owners of the legal business may be actively engaged in it, unaware of it altogether, or just kind of turning a blind eye. An interesting element of this segment is that it's not just solicitation that will often occur at these venues, but it's often where a lot of recruitment happens as well. So within each of these segments, the network structure can manifest in different ways, which can help us to determine trafficking risk levels. For example, if you have a truly independent provider, then the network consists of one node, meaning that they do not work with other sex providers. This provider is essentially self-employed. However, it's extremely rare that a provider in the industry works completely alone. Often they'll have these close relationships with other providers in the industry for safety and information sharing, really. And sometimes independent providers may even work together for a brief period of time in a sort of partnership. For example, they might advertise together in multiple person specials to entice new buyers and provide some safety. What defines this structure, though, is that it is multiple self-owned businesses working together briefly in partnership where there's no hierarchy. This means that providers kind of do their own thing when they're not together, and their patterns will not move outside of these brief partnerships. But if you see similar advertising patterns and characteristics across sex providers, like same websites, pictures updated together, same logistics, consistent client restrictions and prices, which are usually determined by the pimp, If you see all of these sort of shared characteristics where it appears to be much more coordinated, then this can be a bit more indicative of what's known as a stable of sex providers managed by a pimp. The structure of a stable often really stays the same in that pimps aren't always growing the size of their networks. It usually stabilizes around what they can handle. But different sex providers may come in and out as they're recruited by the pimp. If the first time that a sex provider enters the industry is via a two-girl special, sometimes this can signal that the new recruit, who's often quite young, is being introduced or broken into the industry. This is really a common feature of pimp-managed stables, particularly one with a bottom. And a bottom is a sex provider who helps the pimp train, supervise, recruit, and keep the other providers in line. Managed stables are also notorious for what's known as Romeo recruitment, where pimps will sort of feign romantic interest in the recruit and use the intimate partner relationship as a mechanism for manipulation and control. I should note that we see the same structure in other industry segments, but the terminology tends to differ a bit. In massage parlors and brothels, the pimps are often called madams, and they tend to be females who were previously sex providers actually in the industry. In clubs, bars, and casinos, the pimp could be their legal employer who is also managing the commercial sex business. The network structure of groups of sex providers managed by a common pimp or madam is not necessarily evidence of trafficking. However, this structure is marked by extremely close management and very heavy oversight, which can often constrain the autonomy of sex providers. For example, the sex providers will often rely on the pimp or madam for food, clothing, and shelter. Often you'll hear of madams at massage parlors really keeping the sex providers' passports hostage, where the providers will literally live at the massage parlor. Sometimes pimps will join forces with one another. These will typically include informal partnerships, and they help pimps recruit employees, get intel on new business destinations, monitor law enforcement activity, and advertise services. In this type of structure, you'll likely see the same potential for trafficking, but just on a larger scale. For example, pimps and madams may swap sex providers in their stables to keep things fresh for local sex buyers. Something to keep in mind whenever individuals are moved around stables is that this can often be indicative of traffickers intending to keep the individuals disoriented, particularly to ensure that they don't really develop relationships with sex buyers or with anyone in the community who might notice that something is off. Let's say that we have a legal brothel in Nevada, like the one in this Backpage image. It looks like 7 sex providers. Now let's imagine that law enforcement's investigation concludes that the brothel owner is not exploiting the young women. That doesn't really mean that no trafficking is going on, because you may have a network structure that is common in these sort of quasi-legal venues, similar to that in legalized brothels, clubs, and cantina bars. One in which there's a pimp behind the scenes who is coercing one of the sex providers to work in this legalized environment. When this occurs without the knowledge of the business owner, then there are really 2 businesses here. And in this case, the pimp is often an intimate partner to the sex provider. Whereas in massage parlors and strip clubs or cantina bars, the women all work together in the location. And in pimp networks, the stable often travels together and works multiple girl specials. Many escort agencies will manage sex providers that are intentionally not connected to one another or even aware of one another. For example, we identified a Russian escort agency that consisted of Eastern European sex providers. And the organization set up dates for the women, acting as if they're the sex provider, get the 90-day visitor visa. Within those 90 days, they would travel a circuit of cities. Women intentionally never met one another, traveled together, or worked together in any way. We only really knew that they were connected because they had similar travel patterns, moving across the same location in the same order for the same exact number of days. The sex providers working for this organizations, she said that she was primarily doing so in order to make money to cover her mother's brain cancer treatment back in Russia. And she said that she was kind of wide enough to be able to not be afraid of the organization's threats, but that at least a few of the other providers were much younger and were being coerced by the organization, which was threatening their families. And what that means is that a major question to ask when a sex provider is represented by an agency is really what the agency's practices are. Do they act as true protectors and facilitators, or do they seek to exploit when given the opportunity? The way that trafficking manifests in this structure is similar to the others, but feigned romantic interest, like you see in a lot of pimp-controlled networks, is generally not the method of coercion and control here. Agency owners are not likely to have close romantic or social ties with the person. Multi-level enterprises can kind of look like location-based franchise models, which is common for Asian massage parlors, or they can include various types of other business roles, such as recruiters or even dispatchers or call centers. And that was actually the case in an investigation that we worked on with Homeland Security investigations that I'll cover later on. In this type of network, though, there's a larger set of individuals who are traffickers, since there's this entire enterprise really facilitating it. And as hinted by going through all those examples, network structure cannot really be used alone to identify trafficking. Vulnerabilities and characteristics of the individuals also need to be evaluated. The most critical sex provider characteristic that's related to trafficking is age. Minors in the industry are always trafficking victims. And while research really shows that minors rarely enter into the industry without a facilitator actively recruiting them and breaking in, they may or may not be part of an actual network. Recall this independent provider network structure. This could be a homeless youth selling sex to survive, or it could be like a well-known adult film star selling escort services to high-dollar clients. The difference matters. If this person is a minor, then they are de facto a victim. The sex buyer in this case is defined as a trafficker, along with anyone who may have recruited or facilitated them in being in the industry. An individual's conditions are also a key predictor of vulnerability. Such conditions can include things like immigration status, drug dependency, and options for leaving the trade. Foreign nationals in particular, especially those who are undocumented or dependent on someone else for a visa, they may be vulnerable to exploitation due to a lack of opportunities for legal work and threats of deportation. Substance dependence can also leave sex providers vulnerable to exploitation by both facilitators and sex buyers. The same is also true of those engaging in survival sex, which really means that they engage in sex acts for basic survival needs like food, clothing, and shelter. These are individuals with really no other viable options for meeting their survival needs, leaving them extremely vulnerable to exploitation. And finally, if a sex provider has sort of an exploitative schedule, right? If they're always available, if their ads say something like open 24/7, then this can really indicate that she does not control her own working schedule or is under sort of intense pressure to meet a certain quota of sex buyers. If a person is in a network with other providers who have these vulnerabilities, then that person's risk level should be determined with that in mind. Again, being managed by an individual or an organization doesn't automatically mean that you're trafficked. But the question really is whether the practices of the manager indicate that they seek to act as protectors or facilitators, or do they seek to exploit when given that opportunity? If they are repeatedly and systematically recruiting highly vulnerable individuals, this can indicate a pattern of behavior that is seeking to manipulate and control. In addition, there is the added challenge of fluidity over time. Looking at a network or a worker in a snapshot of time really does not tell the whole story. An individual enters the commercial sex industry due to either coercion, which is trafficking, circumstance, which is survival sex, or choice, which is voluntary. Each day that they remain in the industry is due to one of those three reasons as well. And so this highlights the need to look at an individual's experience in the industry over time. Someone could enter the industry because they lost their job and they had no other options for putting food on the table. A few months later, they may be recruited by a facilitator who they think will help them with logistics, but in reality takes an enormous cut of the money and maybe threatens their kids to make sure that they don't leave. If you're only looking at how they entered into the industry, you wouldn't see this episode. At the same time, an independent sex provider who is currently in the industry as an adult may have started in the industry as a minor. And that means that this person was trafficked into the industry by whoever recruited or solicited them as a minor, even if they're not being coerced today. This makes it incredibly complex to label a sex provider as either a trafficking victim or not. At what point in time are you talking about? And does the context of their past involvement in the industry matter? This fluidity means that it is also crucial to identify and track traffickers over time via network analysis. Because if they were a trafficker in one situation, then other sex providers connected to them now are probably at higher risk. So now I'll kind of take you through what this process looks like in practice for us, and not just sort of at a high theoretical level. And I'll talk about how that resulted in the dismantling of one of the largest networks in history. Since this all occurred in what I will refer to as the Backpage era, I'll end with what this looks like for us today, too. The internet has largely replaced other means of buying and selling sex because it's safer and it reaches a broader range of customers. From a research and an investigative angle, online ads provide visibility for some of the population that would otherwise be more hidden. Since the overwhelming majority of the industry is advertised online, this is what we've been capturing since 2015 by using web crawling to automatically detect, scrape, and process commercial sex ads at scale. While the specific sources have changed quite a bit, I'll mention later, most of our data at the time of the case that I'll go through today came from Backpage.com. And Backpage, for those who are unfamiliar, it was a website similar to Craigslist that one estimate showed that it accounted for 80% of all online commercial sex advertising. So it was sort of the big hub. And there was also substantial evidence that trafficking victims had been advertised on the site, to include adults and minors. Well, it was only meant to advertise adult escorts. 71% of the child sex trafficking reports that were received by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 71% of those reports involved ads posted on Backpage. As we're collecting, we use data science to make connections across data to identify networks and individual personas within the network. In our context, seeing and identifying a network or an individual person can happen in multiple ways. You can have shared identifiers connecting the ads and the people, similar sort of marketing behavior, and similar network patterns like movement and growth. Making these connections also gives us a sense of the prevalence of people in the commercial sex industry, and consequently, the really percent who are predicted to be trafficked. You can see that sex providers are relatively evenly distributed across population centers. And so it's not just the big cities that dominate the industry. Providers are being advertised in small towns and in large cities alike. For example, while Nebraska barely shows up on this national heat map here, our 2017 study of the extent of the commercial sex market in the state estimated roughly 900 individuals sold for sex each month. In addition to estimating prevalence, we're also able to understand the characteristics of the industry, such as sex provider demographics and the client preferences, the demand. Minority communities are overrepresented in the pool of sex providers. For example, African Americans make up 13% of the US population, and yet they represent 33% of those on Backpage. This overrepresentation is really exacerbated in Nebraska, where African Americans make up 50% of the Backpage sex provider population. Since ads really cater to the tastes of consumers, they provide insight into the market demand. The fact that providers are advertised with euphemisms suggesting their youth, despite the well-known risks of law enforcement, that means that youth is a very important characteristic sought by sex buyers. In fact, there's even a premium on it. The younger the sex provider, the higher the hourly rate they are able to advertise. And this effect is the strongest among very young women, ages 18 to 25. But it goes away entirely once a woman is over the age of 30. This has some serious consequences. It creates incentives for traffickers to recruit younger females, and it also means that the industry experiences high turnover owing to the dramatic decline in demand as the provider is less able to be marketed as youthful. When multiple sex providers work together and have similar advertising patterns, this can be an indicator of having a facilitator. Facilitators, in turn, can constrain the autonomy of sex providers. The majority of those advertised on Backpage.com appear to work in groups. Some of them even advertised in multiple girl specials as a sort of package deal. Often, the individuals sold for sex are recruited from vulnerable populations. And this is clearly evidenced in the data, where an overwhelming majority of the sex providers appear to be in the sort of lower end of the commercial sex market, where survival sex is often the only means of meeting basic needs. This is reflected in the comparatively low hourly rates. The average is less than $200 an hour. It's also reflected in their being sold frequently, and the increased likelihood that they experience drugs is part of their job. They're also the most likely to advertise to truckers and military personnel. And we should note that most of the Asian sex providers and nearly every provider affiliated with a brick and mortar facility are in this group. Additionally, we also find indicators of potential foreign nationals in the industry who are exceptionally vulnerable to exploitation by facilitators or managers. Some will be referred to as an import from a foreign country or a new arrival. And the commercial sex industry is exceptionally young. Nationally, 14 to 18% are advertised under 21, and 30% are advertised using phrases that imply that they're very young. And since it's impossible to post a Backpage ad listing an age under 18 years, the average age of providers is probably quite a bit younger than the average posted age. For example, in this ad here, it's posted with an age of 29, but the girls are described in the actual body of the ad as being 19, right? So that's one way that they try to get around it. Based solely off of these online ads, our 2017 Nebraska study estimated about 70% of providers have at least some risk indicator, being young or working in groups, likely to have an active facilitator. This does not necessarily mean that they're trafficked. Some are at higher risk than others. And we assess that about 15% are at a high risk of being exploited in a situation that constitutes trafficking. A lot of our work really centers around increasing the quality, though, of these risk indicators, since that results in better local and national estimates of trafficking. And it also permits increasingly kind of better identification of individual victims. Again, the nature of victimization means that you can't really just take a survey sample and ask if they've been trafficked. Being able to really answer that question takes time, and it requires partnering with law enforcement and service providers for long-term studies. So that's really what we did. We provided some of these high-risk network law enforcement as trafficking leads. This led to some major successes, including the identification and recovery of a legally low-functioning adult victim. And it also led to the dismantling of the largest international sex trafficking organization to date, which I will get into now. So Operation Extended Stay was sort of a network trafficking young Asian women across the country, to include in Nebraska. And I guess that I should mention that HTI Labs, we're headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. We don't just have a weird interest in the state that is in the middle of the country. But this particular case, it really showed how well our algorithms can work. We were able to identify just how widespread the network was. And then law enforcement was able to prove this and turn it into really a hallmark case that snowballed into a lot of other cases. I remember for years wondering what in the world was wrong with our algorithms, because they were causing this huge percentage of Asian escort ads to be part of the same network. And this case really caused me to realize that I wasn't crazy, and that we were really onto something with the way that we were able to connect things. So we provided a lead of a network based on high risk indicators from our online commercial sex ads and from sex buyer reviews on message boards, which we also scrape. According to our algorithms, the sex providers were newly arrived foreign-born individuals advertised at a young age in multiple girl specials. Some posts advertising up to 4 girls at one time. And the posting patterns or syntax were somewhat similar in that they described the available services and price structure, physical measurements, and they stated that they would do in-call services only. Sex buyers would frequently state in their reviews that these providers appeared quite young, seemed to be from Thailand and China, and that they were not able to speak English very clearly. The results raised major concerns, such as the girls working in calls to hotels in an assembly line, on sort of what the sex buyers described to as like a first come, first served basis. And really what the sex buyers were describing in these reviews was something akin to a high volume massage parlor operating out of a hotel, where there are waiting lists and there is no guarantee that a sex buyer will end up seeing the girl that he originally booked. Working off of the lead that we provided, law enforcement was able to find a receipt for a bank transaction, which led to the identification of an email address. And in providing us with that email address, we were able to identify more ads and phone numbers associated with the network. And we then provided that to HSI, and that allowed them to sort of subpoena Backpage for the information behind all of those ads. And the subpoenaed information include about 715 ads with associated user account info, to include IP address from which the ad was posted, and then also the Backpage city that the ad was posted to. Interestingly, there were multiple user accounts posting ads from the same IP address. When we compared the IP addresses of ads to the actual advertised location of the sex provider across these user accounts, we gained a lot of insight into the structure. Not only were there multiple Backpage accounts posting from the same set of IP addresses, but there were ads being posted from an IP address in California or Florida to Backpage sites all over the country. And we knew that the women showed up in all these cities due to the sex buyer reviews. For example, in one of the dominant IP addresses that was located just outside of Los Angeles, a lot of these user accounts were using this IP address, but they were posting ads in, you can see from the image, like North Dakota. And multiple different Backpage accounts were posting the ads in North Dakota from Los Angeles. And so it was clear that the user accounts were not operating out of their own specific territories, given the amount of overlap. This was honestly quite baffling at first. In a sort of brief analysis that I wrote to HSI almost 3 years ago, actually, after providing an example from the data, I wrote, this means that 3 different user accounts from 3 different locations, all advertised in Albuquerque within 1 day of one another, posting the same exact phone number in the body of the ad. Why would they do this? Well, it turns out that this organization had call centers headquartered in LA, Orlando, and to a smaller extent, New York City. These call centers would dispatch women all over the country. This was truly an entirely new organizational structure that had not previously been encountered. A lot was understood about smaller trafficking networks that fit the structure for a pimp-managed stable that I went through earlier. And much was known about these sort of larger massage parlor networks. But law enforcement hadn't really come across a massive in-call network operating through a layer of dispatchers that, housed in call centers. Here's the sort of interesting piece of this, though. Backpage did not provide all of the data because they didn't store every iteration of an ad, and users almost always edit their ads. So we were able to really take the ads that we received from the Backpage subpoena and crawl out from them via our database to identify the full set of ads belonging to these users. This exercise really showed that the Backpage subpoenaed ads were missing the New York operations entirely. More importantly, this went from a network being responsible for, roughly 715 ads to a network being directly responsible for 10,000 ads and related to nearly 9.8 million ads. So this resulted in the largest international sex trafficking investigation in history and snowballed into the largest domestic sex trafficking investigation in history, with millions of dollars in assets seized. In terms of venue, they largely used extended stay hotels, hence the name of the investigation. And they also used some apartments. They'd often really rotate the sex providers to keep things fresh for buyers. And so the sex providers were changing cities often. In terms of the advertising, they really figured out what pictures and syntax worked best, and then they used them over and over again in various places across the country. They essentially found a formula for what the buyers would respond the most to. And so there was no real individuality in the ads, although the sex buyers thought that they were contacting the women, when in reality, they were contacting a call center. Sex buyers generally paid direct cash to the sex providers, and the sex providers then paid the agency a certain percentage of what they made, where the dispatchers were really part of that agency under the ownership. The sex providers then used WeChat actually to send what little leftover funds that they had back to family in China. This network was estimated to be directly responsible for hundreds of young women, kind of going in and out over time. Learning from known investigations like this is really crucial for further improving our algorithms and also our overall understanding of the industry. So through our work in this Backpage era, we were able to learn a lot about what worked well and what didn't work well to identify and take down trafficking. And that's really shaped how we're moving forward with improved strategies. So the commercial sex industry is constantly evolving in response to technological change, the market, and law enforcement efforts. For instance, when Craigslist went down, it took down its adult section in 2010. Online commercial sex ads really moved to Backpage.com. And then when credit card companies stopped processing transactions with Backpage, the website began accepting advanced cash payments in Bitcoin. When Backpage was shut down and subsequent legislation was passed, online commercial sex ads moved to a more decentralized set of largely offshore websites. And in 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we really saw that the financial duress attending the crisis has brought many first-time entrants into the industry, which has been experiencing a really major shift in venue from massage parlors and hotels to online webcam activity. So the industry is in constant flux, right? This is really important because it underscores how critical it is to conduct ongoing R&D. Not only have we needed to pull in new sources of information from the dozens of new websites emerging and disappearing, but we also kind of needed to figure out how we link things to sort through all of the noise and identify coherent networks. One of the major lessons learned is how critical machine learning is in helping to kind of reduce the amount of work that needs to be redone with every slight change in the industry. And so we've rebuilt our system to be more robust to shifts and adaptations. A lot of our work centers around increasing the quality of our trafficking risk assessment, but being able to really answer the question of whether force, fraud, and coercion is present, it really requires partnering with those on the ground. We originally thought that this partnership would look like us providing a lead and then law enforcement telling us whether or not it was trafficking after they concluded their investigation of it. Something that we really didn't anticipate was just how useful data science can be throughout this investigative process. And so we've become deeply integrated with our law enforcement partners, thanks to our involvement in a number of operations and investigations, to include some that are ongoing. The most successful case, really the most successful set of cases, occurred when we worked alongside our law enforcement partners to turn a lead into a prosecution in a sort of iterative fashion, because new information that they uncover may connect a few dots and change the understanding of the overall network. And that is really extremely helpful for those on the ground who are having these conversations to determine the potential of force, fraud, and coercion. Because of that, we are rebuilding our leads platform to better facilitate this collaborative, interactive process. where our online data can combine with their on-the-ground knowledge to increasingly understand the network and sort of refine the intelligence requirements until we're able to answer the question, is this trafficking? If you recall at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that the anti-trafficking efforts are left up to a decentralized set of entities who are mandated to do something about it. But different entities may notice one or two small red flags that alone wouldn't really signal trafficking. It's only once it's taken all together that you can see it as a clear situation of trafficking. The problem is that this requires the system to talk to itself. And that's one of the most longstanding and famous challenges when it comes to government. For example, about a year ago, a young woman was advertised online whom we deem to be like moderate, potentially high risk. She was advertised in 2-girl specials, and sex buyers mentioned that she seemed sleepy or shy. At the time, I was really on the fence on whether this was a high risk enough to put on law enforcement's radar. But she just so happened to advertise one day when I was in a room with our law enforcement and Department of Health and Human Services partners. We were working on a separate case. And she had advertised that time, and so I asked them to look her up in the off chance that they had any additional information that suggested high risk. What we found really was astounding. There were multiple times where the system should have identified her as a likely trafficking victim. There was one report saying that she had been advertised by her abusive partner on commercial sex websites, yet another report finding her to be low functioning with the explanation sexual exploitation of a vulnerable adult. There were also reports of domestic violence incidents requiring hospitalization, where she was dropped back off afterwards at a motel that she was staying at with the abuser. And she wasn't the only victim, right? Hence the sort of 2-girl specials that we saw in the ads. That same abuser, the trafficker, also had a history of domestic violence with another woman who nearly disclosed the situation to an ER nurse. Before the trafficker showed up to the ER, she stopped talking and then he made her leave with him. So this example really crystallized the cost of information silos. We were already working at that time on developing a procedure for effective screening with the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. But at this point, we really realized that another one-off training or pen and paper tool was not going to make a dent in the problem. We needed software that facilitates the next step. Identifying trafficking, it requires long-term support services and a community working together, which requires collaboration tools. And so that's what we built. PAVE is not only intended to improve a community's detection of and response to a potential situation of trafficking, but it also really allows us to understand those segments of trafficking that won't show up online, like the residential neighborhood brothels that operate through word of mouth and often are trafficking children. I mentioned earlier that immediate self-disclosure of trafficking victimization is extremely rare, but it does become likely over time if someone is connected to services where their basic needs are being met. And that's exactly the process that PAVE facilitates. We've essentially built an ecosystem that takes everything that we do to detect and understand trafficking in the broader sex industry, and it integrates that in with everything that law enforcement is learning through the investigative process, as well as what hospitals, child welfare agencies, and victim services, as well as what they're seeing in a community. Because not every situation can or should be solved by law enforcement. Altogether, this ecosystem really helps to uncover hidden populations and that may or may not be advertised online, but are being exploited in plain sight. If there's one thing that you take away from this talk, I hope that it's not that tech is going to save the world. Research is also not going to save the world. And I say that as a data scientist who spent their 20s building a research and technology company. But research and technology can be thoughtfully embedded in frontline efforts to combat these problems so that facilitates their changing the world.